All right, so today we're going to be diving deep into the psychology of evil.
Ooh, that sounds pretty dark.
Yeah, it is, but it's fascinating stuff. We've got some incredible source material for you guys.
Yeah, tell me more.
We've got excerpts from this book that examines both the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Abu Ghraib scandal.
Wow, those are two really heavy hitters.
Yeah, and get this, we actually have audio recordings from the Stanford Prison Experiment itself,
No way, you're kidding.
like the real deal.
So we're gonna hear what actually went down in that basement prison.
Yep, and it's chilling stuff. But I think it really forces us to ask some tough questions about ourselves, about human nature.
Like, can good people be transformed into doing evil things?
Exactly.
It's kind of a scary thought.
It is, but it's a question we need to grapple with. So let's start with the Stanford Prison Experiment.
All right, take us back.
Picture this. It's 1971, Stanford University, and a team of researchers has built this mock prison in the basement of the psychology department.
A basement prison. Sounds creepy.
Oh, it was. And they recruited these college students to play the roles of either prisoners or guards.
So a pretty simple setup.
Yeah, deceptively simple.
Right.
But the results were anything but.
Right, it became this notorious example of how quickly power can corrupt.
Exactly. And what's so striking, listening to the audio recordings, is how quickly those guards started asserting their dominance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, even before the experiment officially began, you can hear them, like, demeaning the prisoners during the intake process. Making fun of their appearance and just creating this hostile atmosphere right from the start.
Wow, so it was almost like they were primed for abuse from the get-go.
It really seems that way. And of course, the impact on the prisoners was devastating.
I can only imagine.
There's this one prisoner 8612, who started experiencing such extreme stress that he had, like, these sensory distortions.
Sensory distortions? Like what?
Well, for example, he kept feeling his stocking cap on his head, even though it wasn't there.
That's wild.
I know, right? It just shows how profoundly stress can warp our perception of reality.
And that was just one example of the trauma those prisoners endured.
Absolutely. But, the prisoners weren't completely passive.
Oh. Did they try to fight back?
Yeah, they did try to rebel in various ways. One prisoner 416, even went on a hunger strike as a form of protest.
Wow, that's taking a stand.
It was. But the way the guards responded is where things get really disturbing.
How so?
Well, there was this one guard, the prisoners nicknamed him John Wayne because of his, like, tough guy persona.
Oh, no.
Yeah, not a good sign. And he basically forced the prisoners to choose whether they would punish prisoner 416 for his hunger strike.
So he was pitting them against each other.
Exactly. A classic tactic of those in power, right? Divide and conquer.
It's a tactic we see all too often in the real world, unfortunately.
And it's heartbreaking to hear the prisoners describe how dehumanized they felt.
Dehumanized?
Yeah, one prisoner even said he felt like cattle, just completely stripped of his individuality.
That's chilling. It's like they were seen as objects, not human beings.
And that's a key part of what allows evil to flourish, right? When you dehumanize someone, it becomes easier to justify cruelty and abuse.
It's like creating a mental blind spot to our own morality.
Exactly. And unfortunately, these dynamics aren't limited to a simulated prison environment.
Right. We see this play out in the real world all too often.
And one of the most disturbing and well-documented cases is the Abu Ghraib scandal.
The abuses that happened there were horrific.
Absolutely. It was a U.S. military prison in Iraq that became infamous for the torture and humiliation of Iraqi prisoners.
It was a dark chapter in American history, that's for sure.
It really was. And there was this staff sergeant, Chip Frederick, who was in charge of the night shift at the prison.
And he was involved in the abuse.
He was. And one thing he said that really stuck with me was his description of a ghost detainee, a prisoner who had allegedly been killed by a special operations unit.
A ghost detainee.
Yeah, it was just so casual the way he talked about this death, like it was nothing.
That's a sign of serious moral disengagement.
Right. It's like he had completely detached from the consequences of his actions and the actions of those around him.
It's a defense mechanism, a way to cope with the psychological burden of doing terrible things.
And the abuses at Abu Ghraib were just horrific. Physical beatings, sexual humiliation, using dogs to terrorize prisoners.
It's hard to even fathom the suffering those prisoners endured.
It is. And what's so disturbing is that these weren't isolated incidents.
Right. Similar abuses have been documented in other prisons and conflict zones around the world.
It suggests that there's something about these environments, these systems, that foster this kind of cruelty.
It's like the situation itself becomes an actor, influencing behavior in ways that we might not even be aware of.
And Frederick himself described the atmosphere at Abu Ghraib with a phrase that's really stuck with me. He said, it was becoming ever more like a palace than a military prison.
That's a chilling description.
It is, but it really captures the toxic and dehumanizing environment that had been created.
So we have these two seemingly disparate cases. The Stanford Prison Experiment, a simulated environment, and Abu Ghraib, a real-world war zone.
And yet there are some striking parallels between them.
Like what?
Well, in both cases, you have ordinary people who, under normal circumstances, would likely never engage in such horrific behavior.
But when placed in these specific environments, they transform?
Exactly. It's as if the situation itself overrides their individual morality.
It's the power of situational forces.
Right. And these forces can be incredibly strong.
Absolutely. Think about it. Anonymity, dehumanization, diffusion of responsibility, these are all factors that can contribute to evil acts.
And we see these factors at play in both Stanford and Abu Ghraib.
It's a recipe for disaster, really.
It is. And what's truly unsettling is that these situational forces aren't limited to prisons or war zones.
Right, they can crop up anywhere. In workplaces, in schools, even in our own families.
It's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder, if any of us were placed in these situations, could we resist the pressure to conform?
Would we have the strength to stand up and say no to evil?
It's a question that's haunted philosophers and psychologists for centuries.
And there's another layer of research that can shed some light on this. The Milgram obedience experiments.
Ah, yes. Milgram's infamous experiments.
Yeah.
Those were groundbreaking in a terrifying sort of way.
They really revealed how susceptible we can be to following orders, even when those orders go against our conscience.
Okay, for those who might not be familiar with Milgram's work, can you give us a quick rundown of the experiment?
Sure. Basically, participants were told they were taking part in a study on learning and memory.
Sounds harmless enough.
Right, but here's the twist. They were instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner who was actually an actor every time the learner got an answer wrong.
So shocks weren't real.
Nope, but the participants believed they were.
Oh, wow.
And with each wrong answer, the voltage of the shock was increased, ultimately reaching levels that would have been incredibly painful, even deadly.
I can't believe anyone would go through with that.
Well, that's the shocking part. 65% of the participants went all the way, administering the highest level of shock, despite hearing the learners screaming in pain and begging them to stop.
65%.
Well,
That's incredible.
it really is, and it shows just how powerful the influence of an authority figure can be.
So we're talking about ordinary people with no history of violence, inflicting pain on a complete stranger simply because a guy in a lab coat told them to.
Exactly. And Milgram identified several key psychological mechanisms at play here. Gradual escalation of commitment, diffusion of responsibility, and of course, the powerful influence of an authority figure.
And when you think about it, those same factors were also present in both the Stanford Prison Experiment and Abu Ghraib.
Absolutely. In all three cases, you have people caught up in systems that either encourage or condone unethical behavior.
It's a disturbing pattern that we see repeated throughout history, unfortunately.
And it raises a crucial question for all of us.
Yeah.
How easily could we be manipulated into doing something we believe is wrong?
How susceptible are we to these forces of evil? That's something to really ponder.
It is. And it's a question we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into these cases.
All right, so before we move on, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the ethics of the Stanford Prison Experiment itself.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is. I mean, the participants endured significant psychological distress, and the experiment had to be shut down early because things got so out of control.
There's been a lot of debate over the years about whether the experiment was ethical.
Yeah, some people argue that the researchers went too far, that they didn't do enough to protect the participants.
And then there's the question of Philip Zimbardo, the lead researcher, who took on the role of the superintendent in the experiment.
Some people have criticized him for getting too caught up in the simulation, for allowing the situation to spiral out of control.
It seems like he struggled to balance his role as a researcher with his responsibility for the well-being of the participants.
And I think this really highlights the importance of having strong ethical guidelines and oversight in research.
Absolutely. The pursuit of knowledge should never come at the expense of human dignity.
It's a lesson that applies not just to research, but to any situation where power dynamics are at play.
in our workplaces, our communities, even our personal relationships.
We all have a responsibility to be aware of the potential for abuse and to speak out against it whenever we see it.
It's not always easy, but it's essential if we want to create a more just and humane world.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
I'm already feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all this darkness.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in. But I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless.
Right, we have a choice.
Yeah, exactly. We can choose to be aware of these forces, to understand how they operate, and to develop strategies for resisting them.
And that's what we'll be exploring in our next segment.
We'll be talking about what we can do as individuals to make sure we don't become perpetrators or even bystanders to evil.
Because the line between good and evil is more permeable than we'd like to think.
And it's up to each of us to make sure we stay on the right side of that line.
So join us next time as we delve into the psychology of heroism and explore what it takes to be a force for good in the world.
And in the meantime, listener, keep those questions coming and keep reflecting on what you've learned today.
Because the journey towards understanding human nature is an ongoing one.
And it's a journey we're all in together. Yeah, that was a lot to process.
Heavy stuff, right?
For sure. But okay, so we've talked about these dark forces, these situations where even good people can do bad things.
Right, the Lucifer Effect.
Exactly. But now I want to know, like, what can we do about it?
How do we resist that pull?
Right. How do we make sure we don't become like those guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment or the soldiers at Abu Ghraib?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to cultivate a sense of mindfulness.
Mindfulness.
Yeah, like really paying attention to the present moment and being aware of our thoughts and feelings.
So like not just going through life on autopilot.
Exactly. It's about stepping out of those automatic reactions and really evaluating the situation.
Okay, so like if we find ourselves in a situation that feels ethically murky, we need to hit the pause button.
Right. Ask yourself, what's happening here? How am I feeling? What are my impulses telling me to do? And are those impulses aligned with my values?
You mentioned values. That seems pretty crucial here, right?
It is, absolutely. Cultivating a strong moral compass is another key strategy for resisting the Lucifer effect.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we develop that inner compass that will guide us towards ethical choices?
Well, it starts with self-reflection. Take some time to really think about your core values.
Like, what do I believe is right and wrong?
Exactly. What are the principles that guide your actions? What kind of person do you want to be in the world? These are big questions, but they're worth pondering.
I think it's easy to say, oh yeah, I know right from wrong. But it's different to actually live by those values.
It is. It takes effort. It takes courage sometimes to do what's right, especially when you're facing pressure to conform or to look the other way.
Because let's face it, going along with the crowd is way easier than rocking the boat.
It is. But if we want to prevent evil, we can't just be passive observers.
We have to be willing to speak up.
Exactly. Silence in the face of injustice is a form of consent.
And that reminds me of something you said earlier about the importance of community.
Yes, our social environment plays a huge role in shaping our behavior.
So like surround yourself with good people.
Exactly. Find people who share your values, who will support you in making ethical choices.
People who will call you out when you're messing up.
Exactly. It's like having a network of moral support.
Okay, so mindfulness, strong moral compass, good people around us. What about self-care? Does that play a role in all of this?
Absolutely. Self-care is crucial.
I think people sometimes think of self-care as like, bubble baths and face masks.
Yeah, it's more than that. It's about taking care of our physical, mental, and emotional well-being.
Because if we're not taking care of ourselves, we're more susceptible to stress, burnout, all that stuff.
Exactly. And when we're depleted, we're more likely to make impulsive choices, to compromise our values.
It's like when you're hangry.
Right. You're not exactly your best self when you're hangry.
Not at all. So we need to make sure we're getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, exercising, all of that.
And don't be afraid to seek professional help if you need it.
Therapy, counseling, support groups, there are resources available.
Self-care is not selfish. It's an act of self-preservation.
And it can help us be better, more ethical people.
Exactly. When we're grounded and centered, we're less likely to be swayed by those external pressures.
Okay, I'm trying to absorb all of this, but it feels kind of daunting.
I get it. It's a lot to take on.
Like it feels like we need to be constantly vigilant, always on guard against the potential for evil.
I don't think it's about living in a state of constant fear.
So what is it about?
I see it more as cultivating a way of being in the world.
So like an ethical awareness that becomes second nature.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect. It's about striving to be better, to make conscious choices.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of something we talked about earlier with the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yeah.
Remember how one of the prisoners described feeling this sense of melancholy when the experiment ended?
It's kind of strange, right? He had been through this traumatic experience.
But he was sad when it was over.
It is a bit paradoxical.
It made me wonder, like, why would anyone feel sad when such a horrible experience is over?
I think it speaks to the complex psychology of roles and identity.
So, like, even when we're in situations that are harmful or destructive, we can become attached to the roles we play,
We crave that sense of belonging, of purpose.
even if it comes at a cost.
It's a reminder to be mindful of the groups and systems we align ourselves with.
To ask ourselves, do these roles bring out the best in me? Or am I compromising my integrity for a sense of belonging?
That's a really important question to ask ourselves.
It is, because ultimately it's not just about avoiding evil, it's about actively choosing good,
Aligning ourselves with forces that uplift and inspire us.
both individually and collectively.
And that's what we'll be exploring further in our next segment.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the company you keep, doesn't it?
It does. Like, are the people around you bringing out your best self, or are they enabling bad behavior?
Right. Are they helping you grow, or are they holding you back?
And it's not always easy to tell.
No, it's not. But okay, so we've been talking about these dark forces, these situations where good people can do bad things.
The power of a situation.
Exactly. And it can all feel a bit overwhelming.
Right. Like, is there any hope?
Yeah. I mean,
That-
can we really make a difference as individuals?
Oh, I absolutely believe we can.
You do.
Yeah. Every system, every institution is made up of individuals, right?
Sure.
So if we want to change the system, we have to start with ourselves.
Okay, I like that. But how do we actually do that? What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, we've already talked about some of the most important strategies.
Mindfulness, strong moral compass.
Exactly. Surrounding ourselves with good people taking care of ourselves.
These are like the foundation.
Yeah, the bedrock of ethical living.
Right. But it's not just about inner work, is it?
No, it's also about taking action in the world.
So what does that look like?
Well, sometimes it means speaking up against injustice. Even when it's scary. Even when it's scary. Sometimes it means challenging the status quo.
And sometimes it's just about being kind.
Right, like choosing compassion in our everyday interactions.
Okay, so it's a both-hand situation.
It is inner work and outer action.
But how do we know if we're making a difference?
How do we measure our impact?
Yeah, especially when we're talking about something as big as resisting evil.
That's a great question, and I think there are many ways to measure impact.
Like what?
Well, it might be as simple as inspiring one person to act with more kindness.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be some grand heroic act.
No, not at all. It could be a quiet conversation, a moment of empathy.
So those small acts of goodness do matter.
They absolutely do. They create ripple effects.
Like the butterfly effect.
Exactly. So never underestimate the power of your choices.
Wow, this has been quite a deep dive.
It has been, hasn't it?
From the depths of human depravity to the heights of human potential.
And hopefully our listeners are feeling a bit more empowered now.
I hope so. Because ultimately, the future is not set in stone.
We have the power to shape it.
Through our choices, our actions,
So go out there and be the change you want to see in the world.
choose kindness, choose courage, choose love.
And never give up on the possibility of a brighter tomorrow.
Well said.
Yep.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, listener.
We'll see you next time.
And in the meantime, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to be the best version of yourself.